Okay, everybody. Well, welcome to today's Talk with Doc. It's my honor to have my good friend, Dr. Steve Grcevich from Key Ministry, along with us. And today we are going to be talking on helping kids with special needs with mental health issues in a pandemic, a very timely topic that we all need to be talking about and be aware about. See how, as ministry leaders, we can be helping our families, and most importantly, how parents can be helping our kids going through this. So, Steve, welcome. Why don't you just take a minute and introduce yourself and let everyone know who you are and what you do?
Well, thanks, Doc. Um, I'm a physician. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist by training. I have a private practice outside of Cleveland in the east suburbs. I spend a fair amount of time teaching at my old medical school, Northeast Ohio Medical University. But I think the reason why, or the primary reason why we're connected, is that for the last 18 years, I've served as the president of Key Ministry. And so we work with churches around the country and around the world to help connect churches and families of kids with disabilities for the purpose of making disciples of Jesus Christ. And historically, from the time that we got started, our focus has very much been on helping churches welcome kids with hidden disabilities. Where we're talking about, conditions where their disability wouldn't be obvious in a still photograph of the child. So that historically we've done a lot of stuff with, kids with mental health issues, families of kids on the autism spectrum, families of kids with other types of developmental disabilities.
Yeah. Yeah, and SOAR, we have loved partnering with Key Ministry and on many endeavors and love working hand in hand. And Key Ministry does many wonderful things, especially in the mental health arena. So a great thing with having Steve here today. So let's dive right into it. I don't know if you can even if you can share maybe some statistics, maybe even to start off. But I've just been hearing staggering numbers of mental health on the rise in kids, suicide rates on the rise, and it's just across the board. But I know it's also with our kids with special needs. Can you address some of that?
Okay, so I can start off by telling you some statistics from our own practice. In the month of December, I was 30% busier, and our practice as a whole had 70% more visits than what we had in December of 2019. So that, the pandemic in general, and in specific, closing schools and the issues with social distancing have had a profound effect on the kids that we serve. In most instances negative, but there've been, in certain cases, there are some kids who are in fact happier and more stable, but they're clearly the exception as opposed to the norm. In terms of like nationwide statistics, I was doing a lecture on this last week, and the group that's been most severely affected are the 18 to 24-year-olds, young adults. Disruption in college, they're more likely to have been working in jobs that disappeared as a result of the pandemic. That their life plans have been most severely disrupted. And I've seen studies using standardized kinds of screens that they use in primary care that have suggested that the rate of depression among young adults is like 40%.
Wow.
Now, with regard to the suicide thing, because it takes oftentimes 12 to 24 months for that data to be assembled. A lot of what we have right now with regard to suicide is somewhat anecdotal. That there was a story that made the rounds about Las Vegas City reopening their schools because they'd had significantly more suicides compared to the year before. That there have been data from other states and other countries that is somewhat mixed and contradictory because, for example, suicide rates went down in Japan in the first couple of months of the pandemic among kids. They went up in the UK in the first couple of months. So you can find whatever statistic you need to justify whatever point of view or whatever point you're trying to make. But on the whole, that this has been, it's been disastrous, in terms of the impact on kids' mental health, and that this is probably likely to go on for a long time to come, even after everybody's vaccinated and everybody's back in school. With regard to sort of the traditional special needs population that that SOAR is known for serving, I suspect that the impact there is also going to turn out to be much greater than in the culture as a whole. I've seen some anecdotal stuff where, and this is through the special needs disability ministry leaders group that you're a part of, where something like 10% of families who have a kid, with a severe developmental disability have been back at church, compared to, probably 25 to 40% when you're looking at the general population. The extent of social isolation among those families has been most severe because, when you have kids, obviously with medical vulnerabilities, the quote unquote typical siblings in those families haven't been able to go to school, haven't been able to participate in their extracurricular activities. The parents have been severely socially isolated. And the other thing that we saw that was particularly an issue for our kids on the spectrum is that here in Ohio, we live in a metropolitan area where there was sort of truly a grab bag of different approaches to how, to how the different communities handled reopening school. So that there were some communities, like one large community that our practice serves, had a hybrid model, but all the kids with special needs went 5 days a week, all day long. The community we live in has done in-person learning with a 3-week exception the entire time this school year. There have been other places that were more restricted. But one of the things that we saw was, particularly for our kids on the spectrum who don't do well with changes in routine, when they went from having school in person to not having school in person to having to do school virtually for like a 6-week time that was sandwiched around like winter break or Christmas break, it was a complete mess. And so that, for kids where routine and consistency is especially important, the disruptions in terms of school being open, have been disastrous. And, in addition to that, for so many of like our families where kids are on IEPs, they may have come up with reasonably effective ways in some districts to be able to teach virtually. It's very hard to virtually give kids, their occupational therapy and their speech therapy and the one-on-one kind of stuff that they need with their special education teachers. And so, again, I suspect that we are going to be spending a number of years seeing those kids try to recover from the impact of what's gone on over the last 12 months.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And, with our families that SOAR serves, I think one of the biggest needs, no question right now, is just the overall need for community, because that's what the kids have missed so much. So many of them, they're not having the relationships they normally have and the connections at school. It's completely different when it's virtual. They're missing the therapies that you're talking about. And so they're just having a hard time having it. All these new routines are hard for them, and they're having a hard time functioning through that and trying to figure that out. And so, I think we need to try to figure out how to help families with creating community and going through that. But with all that, we are definitely seeing, more, depression, like you said, with the families, and they're struggling with that. The kids aren't wanting to do what they normally want to do and things. So let's kind of dive into that. Mom and dad are sitting at home, they're dealing with their child. How can they be aware of, this pandemic? It's not going away anytime soon. Unfortunately, it's here for a while still. We need to be aware that mental health is a real issue and that. So the first thing is just being aware, what are some symptoms? How can we identify that our child might be having some issues going on with mental health?
So some of the things that we would be looking at would obviously, because, the first thing and sort of the most hot button issue comes to mind, would be kids, having thoughts about wanting to kill themselves or end their lives. And, again, the same thing like with a parent or sibling. And if you're routinely having those thoughts, like especially if you've gotten to the point that you've ever contemplated a plan, you need to be talking to somebody like now. Some of the kinds of things that we'll look for. So like when I think about this, when I'm talking to parents about a kid, is that, everybody has different emotional struggles, but it's when it significantly impacts your ability to function in one or more major life domains that typically we would encourage folks to do something about it. So that, in the case of kids, if they are performing significantly below what you would expect from their, age, intelligence, and developmental status academically. If in the context of the socialization that's available during COVID, if kids struggle in an age-appropriate way to socialize with their friends as other friends are doing, in the middle of the pandemic. Third would be if the child starts having a significant difficulty being able to function in an age and developmentally appropriate way as a member of your family. That would be like a third red flag. The fourth, which has been harder to measure because of the pandemic, is that, if a problem's significant enough that it impacts their ability to participate in a lot of like the extracurricular and community activities that kids their age, participate in, like where they live, like church, for example. You start thinking about, youth sports, art, music, clubs, activities, theater, like, so if the kid has an issue with sort of their thinking or emotions that's interfering in at least one of those four areas, school, friends, family, community, I think it's certainly worth a look. Now, when you start talking about the parents, some of the things that you'd be looking for there, again, in a similar way, substitute like work for school. Right. When you start thinking about their struggles, the things that you're going to be looking for is that we know that, again, a lot of folks are prone to, issues with depression, anxiety, abusing substances to a greater degree than what they did in the past. That there was some interesting data that came out of McKinsey and Company in the early weeks of the pandemic, where they found that like 1 in 4 American adults in the first month had abused alcohol and 1 in 6 had abused some other type of substance. So that like if people start having issues with substances that they didn't have before, that would be a red flag. If you're a parent watching this, and if you or your spouse, is having trouble sleeping, if you're noticing significant changes in your eating habits, either like gaining weight, losing weight, when folks start losing interest in things that they would usually enjoy, like, people like, who've been able to continue doing some of the things that they would typically do during the pandemic. People are into the outdoors, hunting, fishing, stuff like that. When they lose interest in doing those kinds of things, or in the case sometimes of like, devoutly Christian people, they lose interest in being part of church, even if church is online, there's small groups online. That would be something to take a look at. If their energy level is significantly different than what would be normal for them. If you notice a significant change in like your memory or concentration or your spouse's memory or concentration, that would be something that would be important to look at. One of the other things I think that one of the signs that people oftentimes overlook that's oftentimes associated with anxiety is anger, and so that like if, we see this all the time in kids where very high percentage of kids that we see who are coming in or being brought in by a parent for anger management problems actually have an anxiety issue. The same thing's true with adults, so that, again, if you're noticing like physical changes in yourself or your spouse, in reaction to, the change in everybody's lifestyle over the last year, inappropriate anger, substance abuse, and obviously, any kind of interpersonal violence or any kind of suicidal thinking, those are all red flags that you need to get some help.
Yeah. And again, first thing, it's always okay to ask for help.
Absolutely.
Never think you need to try to handle this yourself. Always ask for help. If you don't know where to go for help, please contact us at SOAR, contact Key Ministry, and we can help find you the help that you need and direct you places to go. But
yeah, I mean, so some of the things about that, a lot of people, it's not unusual, particularly like in the Southeast, for folks when they have some sort of an issue to reach out to their church first.
Right.
And so that one of the things that we encourage churches to do is that we've very much been pushing the idea of having current referral lists of folks in the community who are able to, to serve both children and adults that may be having struggles. If you, I would encourage folks who have a primary care physician that oftentimes they're an excellent resource when it comes to this, because you might look in your insurance book or you go on your website and you see a list of names of counselors. Your primary care doc's likely to have come across enough people who've struggled with this that they're going to know who's good and who's not, and who does well in terms of being able to play with the other children and to coordinate care. If you're in an unfamiliar place or you don't have a primary care doc, one of the things you can do is if you have health insurance, you can call your insurance company or oftentimes go on their website and they will have lists of folks there. Most counties, at least in our part of the Midwest, have a community mental health board where there are different public and private agencies that they oftentimes support through taxpayer dollars and community funds, and in particular, like if you're in a situation where maybe you or your child are on Medicaid and you don't live near a large teaching hospital that routinely serves that population, your local mental health board would be aware of specific resources and places that you can go for help. So, even though everybody's a lot busier, in our practice, we make room for anybody who's got a need within a week. And most organizations and most practices have found ways to be responsive during this time.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. But again, bottom line, ask for help. One thing I want to just remind those who are watching right now, anyone who's listening, whether you're on Zoom or you're on Facebook Live, if you have questions, we'll take your questions live as well. If you're on Zoom, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A and we'll answer those. If you're watching on Facebook Live, please put them in the chat. I'm watching both of those and we'll be happy to address your questions as we go today with that. So those are some of the warning signs that we can spot and see. Some of the other things that, I've seen a lot too, that, we need to remember too with kids when you talk about things that they'll stop doing that they love, when all of a sudden they don't want to play their video game or, do something with the iPad. Those are red flags with that. So again, when they're doing something out of the normal, and it's okay. We can all have the winter blues, if you would. It's for us, especially in the Midwest right now, it's cold. I don't want to take the dogs out for a walk. The dogs don't even want to go out for the walk right now. It's too cold. But we're talking about something completely different. It's not because you're not wanting to do what you normally do because of other factors. It's because of you just lost that desire. You just prefer not to, and 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 you can maybe answer it better, Steve. What I've heard people describe it as, they feel a blah inside, just that everything is just blah, and they not really like they don't really have an interest in doing anything. They're not really bored, but they just have a lack of desire to do anything. Is that a right description?
Well, what you're describing are emerging symptoms of depression in a lot of folks. Now, again, everybody has bad days. I mean, around here historically in Cleveland, that we have what we call Therapy Monday after yet another Browns loss.
Yeah,
but
we're going through it after the Chiefs lost at the Super Bowl. So
yeah, you might have a bad day or a bad week. It's when things start going on and when you're feeling like that for weeks on end, even if you start having like a sunny day. And in my mind, where the big red flag is when it starts affecting people physically. When your sleep's different than normal, when your eating's different than normal, when your energy level's different from normal, when you find yourself getting more fatigued, doing routine kinds of things. A week or two of what Doc describes, in the situation that we're in, is a normal reaction to stress. When that starts extending into like 3 weeks or 4 weeks or a month or 2 months, that's a sign that there's something going on that you probably need to be paying attention to.
Yeah. All right. So we've talked about the symptoms and how you can identify it. Let's maybe shift to how can we prevent, some of this from occurring, and help our kids, help our spouse or our friends during these times if we see the symptoms, or how can we just prevent the symptoms from occurring in the first place?
Okay, so here's some stuff to think about. That when our ministry works with churches, one of the ways that we contrast serving and including folks with mental health issues, as opposed to what we would traditionally think of as special needs, is that folks who have mental health struggles, typically the nature of their disability is that they are disabled some but not all of the time, and in some but not all environments and situations. And so part of what has produced a lot of the challenges and a lot of the difficulties for folks with COVID-19 is that they find themselves having to function in significantly different environments than what they had in the past. And they may be dealing with very different expectations than what they had in the past. Excuse me for a second. The spammers are clearly loose, and and if I actually unplug the phone, then the ringer rings and rings and rings. So I apologize for that disruption.
It's all right.
But here, let me give you when I think about our groups of kids who've been most impacted, 80 to 90% of our kids with ADHD have struggled significantly more than they did in the past. And part of the reason for that is that when you're an architect and when you're a designer and when you're building a school, you build a classroom in such a way as to optimize the child's ability to learn. You try to remove distractions. It's set up so that their focus can be on the teacher. When you're doing school from your bedroom instead of doing school in a classroom, you're spending your time in a place that's designed to be comfortable, and to chill out. And so, oftentimes there are going to be significantly more distractions at home than what you have with school. One of the things that's been a big struggle for a lot of our kids is that kids with ADHD oftentimes struggle more to get stuff done when they have too much free time. And so, in those instances, we have a lot of kids where maybe the teacher, if they're doing virtual learning, lectures for a half an hour and gives them time to do their work. or the classroom day's been shortened, or all their extracurricular activities went away. When you feel like you have all the time in the world, it becomes a lot more difficult for folks to be able to get started on stuff. The third thing that we've seen that's been a big challenge, for kids and even some of our parents of kids with ADHD, is that because of the technology and because of some of the different systems that school districts are using, you have kids who struggle with organization who may have to look at 3 or 4 or 5 different places on the internet to find their work. Right. One of the things I hear all the time is that the kids are doing their work, but they can't figure out how to turn it in, and they're ending up getting, punished by that. And I had a kid this last week where I actually referred them to the disability services office at their local college, because as they were describing the process they had to go through to turn in their assignments, it'd be hard for me to do, much less a kid who's got like accommodations associated with ADHD. So that's something to think about with kids who struggle with that. Now, with the anxiety piece, which, obviously has been, exacerbated for many people during this time. One piece of advice I've, given to like schools, given to churches, is that the kids and adults with anxiety, basically their brain is hardwired to overestimate the level of risk entering into new and unfamiliar situations. And a lot of things have become very unfamiliar that used to be routine as a result of the pandemic. And, so to give you an example, there's a kid that I see who is really struggling right now. This is a kid where, despite the local school district doing in person for like the fall, both of the parents are healthcare professionals, and because of their concerns about infecting him or him bringing something home and infecting them, he did virtual the whole time and he struggled. But this is also a kid who had significant issues with social anxiety, so that he was more comfortable in the fall not having to deal with sort of the day-to-day interactions with a lot of the other kids at school. But now, his parents are realizing he's struggling academically. They decided to send him back in person for second semester. Now, in person for this kid meant that he's in the 9th grade. So he's setting foot in a new school building that he has never been in before. with plexiglass in place in the lunchroom so that kids aren't breathing on one another. And one of the things that has been a big challenge is getting him comfortable to go back to school. So that, the advice to the school is, can you shoot some video of like what the kids in his class are doing during the day? Can we bring him in like at 4 or 4:30 in the afternoon when you're disinfecting the place to show him where everything is going to be at, and show him like what he's going to be able to expect? It's sort of the same thing with church. That I saw a really good statistic. It was from Tony Morgan, who does a lot of church consulting, that the average church has been running at like 36% attendance wise of what they did this time last year. And so, part of the issue is like, I suspect that for a lot of folks who are prone to struggling with anxiety, it's the unfamiliarity and the not knowing like what to expect. So if I were a senior pastor somewhere, I would like take like my media crew and I would walk through the experience with somebody with a camera of like, what you're going to see when you come to church. Right. In our church, that would mean that there's, a table like by the front entrance with masks for people who don't have a mask. That means that every other pew is roped off, that means that we don't have at the more traditional services, that we don't have a choir sitting in the choir loft anymore. But again, the more that you can show folks who are struggling with anxiety, and the more that they can visualize what they're likely to experience when they are going into a new situation or back into an old situation that's now unfamiliar because of the changes related to COVID, the more that they're able to visualize, the easier time they're going to have making that adjustment. And so it'd be the same thing. Like, for example, if you're a church where you're welcoming back kids with special needs, I'd want to have lots of video and show the parents exactly like what precautions we're taking. I'd film the cleaning crew sort of like wiping the thing down before kids come and after they leave. And so being able to see what the experience is like in advance is one of the most helpful things that you can do for somebody who's struggling with anxiety.
Yeah, that's great. And going right along with that, I absolutely agree 100% and love what you're saying. Not just videoing it, but you can also give them a personal tour during the week to let them see what it would look like. So, because a lot of them, they do better seeing it in person. I know I've talked to some who they don't want to watch another video because they've zoomed out, if you would.
Yeah.
And don't want anything else there. So, just offering the family, hey, come in, I'll walk you through and we'll show you exactly what it looks like on the weekend. And this is how it would be, and go through the process. And again, you're helping them be prepared and see what might be coming.
Yeah. One more thing I would add to this that I think is especially true for people with depression, but especially the special needs families that your audience is familiar with, is that we're going to need a degree of intentionality in terms of reestablishing relationships and maintaining relationships with this population that we haven't had to think about before. Because again, the families of kids with special needs were the first ones to leave, and they're going to be the last ones to come back.
Right.
And the disconnect and the disruption, in terms of their relationships with staff and volunteers at church, their relationship with other families who are served by those programs, and the ensuing social isolation, contributes to a significant degree to to this, to the experience that folks have, with depression. So I know, for example, like one of the things that our church was doing for the families, like a lot of the individuals who were served by the Tebow prom, which was this weekend last year, was, taking them and making sure that they all had gift cards to call DoorDash, to have, a nice meal delivered for like each of the families, to show that, like, we're still thinking about them and we still remember them. But again, I think, taking the time, phone calls, letters, we're getting zoomed out, but like one-on-one via Zoom, between like, a key volunteer, somebody at church, and a parent or a child that they were serving, or, someone who they were buddying. Each of those touch points becomes critically important going forward in terms of, one, helping to mitigate against some of the circumstances that are contributing to this higher risk of depression. And secondly, maintaining and strengthening the connections that are going to bring people back into the church, and allow them to reestablish those networks of relationships when this is all over and it's safe for everybody to gather again.
Right. Absolutely. And I'd go on top, again, I highly recommend every ministry leader that would be out there and listening, make sure you are doing those contacts. Call your families, check up on them, and then before you hang up the phone with them, pray with them. That's important too. If they're not there, you leave a message, circle back, call them back, because here's the thing that happens. And I've had my own parents tell me this. Many times they're not going to answer the phone because they don't know who it is. And so they're screening, makes perfect sense. But they also don't think you really care. They think you're just going through to check a box. And so, they may not say that much, but once they actually realize that you do care for them, you're actually trying to see how they're doing, it's going to completely change everything. And so one of the ways you do that is taking them a minute, and you never hang up before you pray for them. Actually ask, how can I pray for you and your family? And then do it right then and there. If you leave a message, leave a quick prayer on the phone that you're praying for them and that you're going to call them back, and then call them back. Don't ever tell a family that you'll get back with them and then not do it. I know we all get busy, but we cannot allow that to happen. Our families are desperately needing community. And right now, this may be the only community that they can get. So make sure you're doing that. Steve, we got a question that came in, and this is a great question. And I know I've heard this come up a couple times. So Tom and Julie put in, how can we best support the families whose children have had to be put into residential care due to mental health issues, both while they are away from the families and also when they re-enter the home?
Okay, that's a wonderful question. 25 years ago, like my first job out of my child fellowship is that I was the medical director of the largest residential treatment center in Ohio. And so one of the things, like first off, if you have a facility like this in your area, I think it behooves your church to reach out to the facility and start trying to like build some relationships, and to actually, welcome and see what you can do to support the kids who are in a facility like that, if they're able, to come and physically be part of your worship services and, part of your Christian education programming. Some of the things that, like, in thinking about this, like in terms of supporting the families who have had to relinquish custody of their child, in a circumstance like that. I think making sure that you have available, if they're, to be honest, it's interesting that when I think about that population, the percentage of kids who had ended up in a residential treatment center who had regularly gone to church before they went to that center was extraordinarily small. I mean, like we're looking at something like 2%. So that, when you start thinking about like the whole question of support, part of what I think we need to do is that we need to figure out ways of being able to support them before it gets to the point that the parent has, where that's something that's recommended. And so some of the really tangible things that churches can think about doing, is thinking about either in terms of doing something event type based or doing something like relationship based, is looking at being able to provide good respite care and services to some of those families. As a male in the mental health field, one of the things that I was struck by with a lot of these kids was how desperate they would be when they got, to that center. And when I was meeting with them, that any man who spent more than a minute or two giving them their undivided attention was something that they would glean onto. So that one of the things that I would encourage, churches to think about, like big brothers, big sisters, are there ways that churches can promote, and encourage, folks who are able, to be able to volunteer and build into some of these relationships with at-risk kids before it gets to the point that you're looking at that. In a church, like for example, like, in some churches where they have encouraged people to be involved with foster care and adoption, it's, having families, training families that are able to, again, maybe provide like respite for like a weekend or a week in a situation where a kid's struggling or they've been exposed to significant trauma and, the placement that they're in is at risk of breaking down, would all be tangible ways that we can support folks. But again, part of why kids end up in the situations where they're in a residential center, is because they've oftentimes been exposed to multiple adverse childhood events. um, that that there's relationship trauma, because before you end up in a place like that, a lot of times kids are placed in a variety of different foster care kinds of settings, so you have more disrupted relationships. So it's figuring out how to be able to support families before it gets to the point that their kid ends up needing that restrictive a level of care, and to support the people who are the caregivers for the kids, because again, like given what we know and what we're learning about the impacts of trauma, it's becoming very clear that the traditional kinds of psychiatric treatments don't work really well with this population. But again, it's reaching out. I mean, this is just the gospel. I mean, it's reaching out to the folks who are most vulnerable, and unfortunately, given what's going on in our larger society where God's been pushed aside, then there are fewer and fewer people who have like a Christian worldview and try to live by those principles. That means there's a lot more trauma for kids.
Right.
They're a lot less likely to have, they're a lot less likely to have a mother and a father who are living together and working together and caring for them. So, I mean, at a very basic level, it goes back to like, what can we do to support families, and what can we do within our community to help people to understand the importance of sort of, the Christian anthropology of sexuality, a Christian anthropology of marriage. Because, the family was designed by God to be the environment in which, a child would be raised to thrive. Oftentimes, again, the reason why they end up in those placements is because they don't come from families that were prepared to help them thrive. And to the extent that we as Christians and we as the church can support families in doing that, we can bless them in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I agree completely on the whole respite part, trying to help support them. It goes back to what I was saying earlier. We really need to find community, and that's one of the things to help with our families. And I think we have to redefine how we do it. I know with SOAR, we've been doing virtual respites, but we're now coming back, and we're going to, here in another month, a couple months, we're going to launch in-person respites again. But ours are going to be completely different. We're redoing it how we did. They're going to be smaller. We're only taking 10 families at a time and their siblings, and it's going to be a much smaller. Maybe you can only do 5 families at a time to have the numbers that you need. But guess what? That's helping 5 families, and that's an important thing. We're doing 10 families on Friday night, and then we'll do 3 events on Saturday with time in between. So we can take 40 families on a weekend in over 4 events where we can do that and start creating some community again. The individuals need the community, the parents need the community. Again, anyone out there, if you're trying to figure out how to do respite in that, please contact us with SOAR. We'd love to come alongside you. Don't stand on the sideline and say it's too hard. It's not. It doesn't take much to do it. It's super easy. But anything we can do to come along these families is going to be huge to help them.
Well, yeah, I would agree with everything you just said. One of the things, again, this is 25 years ago, and I was working in residential. And in our area at the time, while relatively few of those facilities still exist, the ones that did oftentimes had denominational tie-ins. So that like one of them was tied into like, one was tied into like the Methodist Church, for example. And one of the things that we started doing was that we actually took a building that we converted into apartments, because one of the challenges with kids being in an out-of-home placement, it comes back to the environment. They've learned how to live in a residential facility, but they haven't necessarily learned how to live when they're back together with their parents. And so one of the things that we did is that we would admit families for 4 to 5 days, and do 20 hours of intensive family therapy and put the kid back together with their parents in a home-like environment to see if they had mastered some of the things that they needed to do to be able to thrive back in that environment. So if you're a church kind of thinking about this with, with maybe like a local group home or some sort of a residential facility, if they have the ability to provide like the therapeutic piece of it and and the family support piece, being able to provide physical spaces for kids to be able to spend time with their families while they work through these things, if they're in a group home or residential placement, is something that churches could do that would clearly be helpful and supportive.
Yeah. Steve, I've got another question that came in from a parent, and it's great, dealing with anxiety. She says she's a parent of a 12-year-old girl with Down syndrome who never had anxiety before, but now has such anxiety about being around anybody because of COVID, so much that she will not leave the house. How can she help her daughter in overcoming this?
Okay, so interestingly enough, when I know in Greater Cleveland, the Mental Health Board was doing a needs survey, and the single greatest area of mental health need and the greatest underserved area had to do with adults and kids with intellectual disabilities. And so I would encourage her to think about like the developmental pediatrics and child psychiatry, are uniquely trained to deal with some of these situations. In our particular community, that there's a long history within neurology and developmental peds, of helping families in these circumstances, so that I probably don't get to see as many kids who would sort of fit that profile. But oftentimes, again, and the parents can be really helpful because, in kids who can't necessarily verbalize what's going on with them, from a professional standpoint, having a parent who's able to share fairly detailed observations about sort of their sleeping, their eating, changes in behavior, getting into sort of changes in the fine details of their routine. That's what we depend upon for information when we have a child who's either so young or from a developmental standpoint, not in a position where they easily express themselves by using words. And so, I mean, there is help available for, families who are struggling with that. Interestingly enough, I had a kid, this was probably a month ago, who had, probably, a moderate intellectual disability, but it had spina bifida, was confined to a wheelchair, and it had like a very abrupt change in mental status. And interestingly enough, that kid, he ended up having COVID and getting hospitalized with encephalitis.
Oh, wow.
I've had a couple of kids who've had, like, one of the things that there's been a lot of talk about are what we call like PANS or PANDAS, like these psychiatric symptoms that are associated with immune reactions to different infections. And, you'll find all kinds of stuff when you start searching this out on the literature. But I've had a couple of kids, two of them now on the autism spectrum, where, they had changes that I clearly thought by the time course of that were related to their experience of having COVID.
Yeah.
And so that, I would think about those medical things too,
Right.
particularly if your kid had like other, kinds of symptoms, or if other kids in the family maybe had been exposed.
Right. Yeah, and I'd say, on this case here that this mom is talking about, never forget the use of something as simple as a social story. Creating a
Mhm.
social story is a great way that can really help an individual who does have an intellectual deficit to maybe understand. And there are a ton of great social stories that are out there right now, whether it's how to wear a mask or just what COVID is, that will really help explain in that. So use some of the things that are out there, but social stories are a great way to kind of help go through that these individuals or friends can understand it when they see the story instead of you just trying to verbalize it to them. So use multiple avenues when trying to get that. And then again, I'll piggyback on Steve. If these things aren't working, seek help, get help for your child, because we don't want to scar them. We don't want to lead it to anything else, and we don't want them become a recluse just where they're stay at home all the time. So always be willing to seek help. And again, that's whether it's your child, whether it's yourself, whether it's a friend, seek that help, ask, and there's many people out there to help. So, well, Steve, we're, unbelievable. We're coming to the top of the hour with that. But with that, let me just throw to you, any parting thoughts that you want to make sure we cover today before our time ends?
One of the things that I'm really concerned about, and I've told this with our team, that it was really hard for me going back to church in person, seeing how few people were there. And, a lot of churches are really reeling right now. Folks who are in pastors' vocational ministry are dealing with some really difficult stuff too. And, to be honest, I've seen a lot more pastors' kids now than I did a year ago.
Yeah.
So a couple of things I think that we need to be really mindful of is that we have to be very intentional of building back into and doing some of the things that you talked about, in terms of maintaining relationships with folks that we don't see. Because I have this fear that when this is all over, that there are going to be a lot fewer folks in church where the parents are hearing the gospel preached on a weekly basis. The kids, are, taking part in, the typical kinds of activities that churches have to disciple them. And the folks are going to be missing out on those relationships. And so that, given that we deal with, largely a faith-based audience here, it's reaching out to people, making sure that folks you haven't seen at church, continue to feel connected. And one of the things I would encourage, folks to do who, again, are watching this because they're already part of a church, this is something that's important to them, is, take care of your pastors and your church leaders.
Yeah.
That this is a time, they need encouragement, they need support. A lot of them, they're not getting rich, and, they have families to support. And when there's only a third the number of people at church as what there were a year ago, they get worried. So at the same time, we're encouraging them to speak into our families who are impacted. I think we need in turn, to be able to care for and support them. And, one of the big theme recently that's been discussed in the special needs and disability ministry leaders group is about, folks with disabilities becoming identified as leaders in ministry. Well, you know what? If you're a family and you've got a kid and you're struggling with this stuff, this is your opportunity to step up. Right. You can reach out to other families. There's Jillian Palmiotto from down in Atlanta has had a couple of wonderful articles on our blog in the last week about special needs families from their ministry that are starting house churches and inviting other families, with kids who have been impacted by disability in a safe and socially distanced way to regularly gather together. And I think that that's a wonderful model going forward. And so, if you're the kind of person watching this video today and you haven't thought of yourself as being in ministry, this is a great opportunity to join the team and start looking for people around you that you can potentially serve.
Amen. 100% agree. And again, I've got one requirement for you to be able to serve and help an individual with special needs or with mental health. And that only requirement is, can you be a friend?
Mm-hmm.
And if you can be a friend, you know what? We can train you on how to do everything else. You don't have to be afraid that you don't understand mental health or you don't understand autism. Don't allow it to scare you. Don't allow society to scare you with that. Because I'll tell you what, these individuals are amazing people. They have so much to offer, and the Bible flat out tells us, if you serve them and work with them, you will be blessed. Your church will be blessed. And I've seen it over and over and over again. So, contact us here at SOAR. We'd love to help you get with that and figure that out. But we want to help with that. Again, if you are interested in learning how to do a respite or create some of this community, contact us at SOAR Special Needs. You can reach us at info@SOAR. Again, it's SOAR specialneeds.org. And we'd love to help you. I got some upcoming events I just want to let everyone know about real quick. First, next week on the 16th, our Wonderfully Made VIP series for our conference, Barb Stanley is going to be talking on 5 questions for ministry planning. So ministry leaders, that'll be a great talk that you can get in on. You can go for that to our website, soarspecialneeds.org, and get the information for that. We also are offering virtual respites. We'd love to have your church partner with us on those. Our elementary will be in 2 weeks. And then ministry leaders, we have now taken our Kansas City Special Needs Ministry Network and we've become virtual. And so with that, we're welcoming everybody to it. So our next one, we're always the 4th Thursday of every month. This month will be from 12:30 to 2:30 Central Standard Time. If you're interested in that, you can also go to our website. We'll have information and you can get signed up or email us, and we'd love to have you be a part of that and see. If you love what we're doing with these Talk with Docs and want to help partner us with us and sponsor us, you can go soarspecialneeds.org/donate and help us there. But Steve, thank you so much. Very timely talk. Bottom line, remember our families, reach out to them. It's vital that we create community. Parents, find ways that you can create community. And it's absolutely okay if you don't want to go out yet, if you don't want to go to church yet, you don't feel like that. But we've got to find ways to create community. Again, I hate the term social distancing. It needs to be physical distancing because we must still be social. And I think that's what a lot of people have forgotten through this pandemic. They've forgotten the whole social. Humans are meant to be social. And so we've got to help one another through that and know we're here to help you. So also, if any of you are out there and you're a church or ministry, you're wanting to learn how to welcome individuals with mental health into your church, please reach out to Steve and the Key Ministry team. They are phenomenal with that. They are the best in the business with it, and they will come alongside you and help you all along the way, give you resources. Their website's got great information as well, keyministry.org. So go there and check them out, and they'll help you as well. So Steve, again, thank you so much for being with us today. So appreciate it.
Doc, thanks for having me, and thanks for all the wonderful work that you and your team do at SOAR.
All right. Well, everyone, we are going to take a couple weeks off, and we'll be back with you. One of our next talks will actually be how to deal with culture in ministry. And so bringing in multicultural, and we got a lot of other great talks coming up. So make sure you be checking out our website, find out everything coming up. But hope everyone stays warm, stay safe. Make sure you tell everyone how much you appreciate them, and stay connected. Tell everyone that you appreciate them. The bottom line, come SOAR with us. Have a great day. Bye-bye.